Warning: this film contains images of blood, gore, and violence that may be unsuitable for certain audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
What is it that you fear? What are the things that keep you awake at night? The things that make your heart pound? Depending on what generation you're in, the answer could vary from ghouls and vampires to homicidal maniacs and demons from another realm. Throughout film history, the horror genre has evolved with society, using the fears of the current generation and exploiting them to create films that scare their audiences. However, the scare tactics and subject matters of horror films have had to constantly change and grow in intensity to suit an audience that gets more and more desensitized to previous tactics, resulting in intense and over-the-top scares. Horror movies of the current generation tend to be much scarier than the movies of the previous ones. The horror film genre has always played up the fears of the era and reflects the state of society at the time. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, movies were all the rage, with hundreds of people flocking to movie theaters to see the wonders of modern technology at the time, a moving picture. Out of this era came the first horror movies, bringing the nightmares only dreamed of or written between the covers of a book right before the audience's very eyes. At this time, the first horror movies played on the fears of Christian audiences in America, telling stories of demons, vampires, and monsters. In an era that saw society plagued by both world wars and pestilence abound, horror movies of the time channeled the collective anxiety of these events and exploited them to scare the masses. The first horror movie ever made for mainstream cinema was titled The House of the Devil, released in 1896, and it was a silent film about the conjuring of spirits by the character Mephistopheles. While modern audiences wouldn't find this film scary at all, it filled the audience's hearts with dread, being the first film to portray shapeshifting, with characters changing into bats and ghouls. Other instrumental horror films from this era include the monster movie blockbusters from the 40s, such as The Human Monster. The film industry saw a renaissance of cinema during the 50s and 60s, out of which came a variety of films and innovations such as improvements in sound qualities and larger screens in theaters. Horror filmmakers, knowing that they had to capitalize on the revitalization of cinema and appeal to a younger audience long removed from the generations that saw the first horror films, introduced new subgenres of horror to exploit the new fears of the time. One of those subgenres focused on exploiting the population's fears of the criminally insane. With new innovations and discoveries in the field of psychology of the time, horror filmmakers such as Alfred Hitchcock exploited and embellished the ideas of violent psychopaths and phobias in movies such as Psycho and Vertigo. Meanwhile, with the threat of invasion and nuclear war due to the Cold War on the minds of many young people at the time, filmmakers began to popularize horror films about aliens, giant monsters, and even the living dead. With the faces of infamous serial killers such as David Berkowitz, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Charles Manson being shown on mainstream news every night, the 70s and 80s were an abundance of material for horror filmmakers to exploit, giving birth to a new subgenre of horror films. Piggybacking off of the psychological thrillers that came before them, slasher films became popular, telling stories of crazed, stealthy, and seemingly unstoppable serial killers attacking teens in summer camps, during babysitting jobs, in their homes, and even in their own dreams.
My job in making Halloween was to do an exploitation horror film. And the basic premise was given to me by my distributor, Irwin Yablans. He said, let's do a movie about these babysitters who get stalked by a killer. He figured that everybody could identify with babysitting. So many teenagers had done it. And then a little bit later, he came up with the idea of calling it Halloween. Let's set it on Halloween night and call it Halloween. Never been used as a title before. Never been used at all. It was an underutilized holiday, so great. And I was a young director then, and I was hungry for experience, hungry for features. I had done some work before then. I said, sure, why not? Well, when we were making the film, I thought, gee, it's Halloween at night, and people get dressed up in masks. What better way to have a killer not be identified than be wearing a mask?
Since this era, slasher movies have become one of the most recognizable and popular horror subgenres to date, with Ghostface, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, and Jason Voorhees being among the most recognizable characters in film history. After the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City on 9/11, xenophobia spread very quickly throughout the United States, prompting a general anxiety against foreigners and foreign countries, and also prompting horror filmmakers to exploit that fear and create movies focused on unfamiliar places and evil hosts. Some movies focused on tourist characters making a wrong turn and ending up in rural and remote areas, having to fend off with evil strangers that live there. These movies continue to be made to this day, such as Above, So Below, Hostel, The Ruins, and even Midsummer, made in 2019. Also during the 2000s, movies dubbed torture porn garnered mainstream successes with films such as Saw, which depicted overwhelming gore and sought to appeal to a generation that had been so heavily exposed and desensitized to gore and violence through television, the news, and video games. What is new among modern horror films today are the films that exploit the technological and social media-driven age, and the films that have broken away from the idea of corrupting the things that society fears, and more towards taking subjects of discourse in society and making a more direct metaphor of it. Films such as Cell and Friend Request have exploited the modern generation's dependence on social media and technology such as cell phones to scare viewers. On the other side, modern artistic horror movies with political subtext have become a subgenre all their own, with movies such as Get Out, The Purge, It Follows, and Mother having subtext that concerns race, politics, sexual health, and even religion. As one can see, horror movies through the decades of cinema history have been representations of the zeitgeist of their time by exploiting the fears, anxieties, and discourse of every decade to deliver thrilling and horrific experiences for every audience. From monsters and ghouls of the silent era to the political subtext of the modern day, horror films have sought to change and evolve with every generation, incidentally becoming more intense and shocking to keep up with a desensitized audience. So, if you ever want to know the state of an age or generation, maybe the best thing to do is to ask one simple question.
What's your favorite scary movie?